In August 2006, an 18-year-old girl, Natascha Kampusch, apparently came back from the dead. 8 years earlier, she'd been snatched on her way to school in Vienna and kept captive in a specially constructed cellar. In this exclusive and intimate interview, she reveals for the first time the true extent of the abuse she suffered.
There were times when he would torment me and humiliate me. Then he'd grab me really quite brutally. Then he'd try to choke me and beat me.
And the kidnapper's best friend, the only person who met Natascha during her captivity, gives an extraordinary insight into the mind of the man who committed such a callous crime.
He
was very demanding when it came to women.
He
wanted them to be well-groomed, slender and blonde.
This is also the first time that Natascha has allowed a television crew to accompany her into the house, where she was held captive by a sadist throughout her adolescence.
He very much enjoyed having someone to humiliate. And the more I resisted, the more he took pleasure in punishing and degrading me in order to strengthen his own self-esteem.
How did she survive those 8 long, painful years? And how did her relationship change with the kidnapper who stole her childhood? Natascha Kampusch lived alone with her mother on a run-down housing estate in Donaustadt, a suburb of Vienna.
My mother always told me that we should never part on bad terms after an argument, because it would remain unresolved if anything happened to one of us, and we never saw each other again. And that's exactly what happened.
When she left for school on the morning of the 2nd of March 1998, the argument between them was still hanging in the air.
In die Schule ging sie sehr selten alleine.
She hardly ever went to school on her own. But she did that day. I watched her leave through the window. Once she walked behind the shopping center, she disappeared from view. And that was that.
Und da ist sie halt verschwunden und das war's.
Ich hatte zumindest schon mal das erste Drittel hinter mir und dann sah ich eben von weitem.
I'd gone about a third of the way when I saw a man in the distance, standing in front of a white van. He seemed to be waiting for somebody. I thought about crossing over to the other side of the street, but decided just to carry on.
Doch weiter zu gehen.
As I drew nearer, he came towards me.
Kam in seine Nähe und dann kam er eben mir entgegen, schnappte mich und packte mich und
Then he grabbed me and dragged me into his van.
einen Kastenwagen.
I tried to scream but couldn't make a sound. My vocal cords had seized up. Nothing came out.
Ich wusste
I didn't know what was happening to me.
Ich habe in dem Moment
At that moment,
mit meinem Leben
I thought it was the end.
abgeschlossen. Er ist dann mit dem weißen
Then he drove the
Kastenwagen
white van into the garage, wrapped me in a blue blanket and carried me into the
ins
house.
Haus getragen. Er hat mich runtergetragen und
He hauled me downstairs
abgesetzt.
and put me down for a moment.
Damals habe ich das ja noch nicht gewusst.
I had no idea what was going on.
So hat zur Seite geschoben.
Then he pushed the safe aside, opened it all up, then sort of dragged and pulled me inside.
Und dann hat er mich
Then he lay me down on the floor of the cellar and left me in the
auf
dark.
den Boden gelegt im Finstern.
Natascha was usually on time. So when she was 10 minutes late, I thought to myself, where is she? I'll call the school. But no one answered. I tried again half an hour later and they told me she didn't turn up at school today. At that moment, I felt the ground move beneath my feet. Something must have happened. It was as though the earth had just opened up and swallowed Natascha.
Österreich 1.
Austria 1. A 10-year-old girl has been missing in Vienna's Donaustadt since yesterday evening. Natascha wears glasses. She's approximately 1 meter 45 centimeters, has light brown hair with a fringe, and blue eyes.
I just sat there and counted up to 21, which meant that 21 seconds had gone by, and then to 60, and carried on so that I knew how long I'd been alone. But at some point, I lost track.
Later that day, her kidnapper came down to the cellar with the thin mattress which was to be her bed.
At first I didn't want to take off my dress. I didn't want to hand anything over or reveal anything about myself. He took away my school bag. That first day he burned my shoes because he said I wouldn't need them anymore.
The police launched a nationwide hunt. The missing girl lived on the Rennbahn-Siedlung, an estate in Donaustadt. And that's where the search was concentrated. Members of the public called in with information, but no one could find any trace of her.
The 10-year-old girl has been missing for almost 34 hours now. As the police haven't been able to find her, they're searching further afield. Countless tip-offs have led nowhere. She's simply disappeared.
I thought about my parents and how things were. What would my teacher say when I wasn't able to do my homework for a few days? That first day, I wondered how people would react. If my mother even knew that I'd gone, how would she react? Would it be bad if I were away from school for some time? How would I get on with my other classmates? Would I be back soon?
2 weeks later, there was a breakthrough. A potential witness to the kidnap came forward.
Austrian police are investigating the disappearance of 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch, who was last seen on March 2nd before she disappeared.
It was at a roundabout close to Natascha's home that another young girl thought that she saw something suspicious. A young girl wearing a red jacket being forced into a white van parked on the right-hand side of the road.
I couldn't sleep properly. I was often awake at night and didn't move much during the day. I just sat there and stared at the phone and hoped that someone would call.
But even Natascha's mother couldn't imagine what her daughter would have to endure over the coming years. On the 2nd of March 1998, 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch was kidnapped on her way to school. A month after she went missing, there was still no trace of her, despite a massive police hunt. But Natascha hadn't been able to move from the cramped and dank cellar where she was being held captive.
Every drop of water meant more humidity, more mold. It wasn't great either with all the insects and the dampness and the unbearable humidity. There was a musty smell which was horrible in such a small room. It was bitterly cold, damp, disgusting. Really disgusting.
The police ramped up the investigation. They were particularly interested in an eyewitness account of a young girl matching Natascha's description, who was seen being bundled into a white van. Police checked the owners of more than 1,500 white vans. One of them was a man from Strasshof, a commuter town 15 miles from Vienna. His name was Wolfgang Priklopil. Priklopil was a 35-year-old telecoms engineer. His mother had given him the house, and he lived there alone, or so he claimed. When the two detectives called, he told them he'd been at home on the day Natascha was kidnapped. Although no one could confirm his statement, Priklopil had no criminal record, and there was no reason to search his house. So they took photos of his van and wrote a report, which was simply filed away.
In
the beginning, I never knew whether it was day or night because my sense of time became completely unbalanced. At first, there was no way of contacting my kidnapper if I needed anything, but he came every day.
Sondern kam einfach jeden Tag. Allerdings gab es schon eine Möglichkeit, wenn nämlich
Later on, though, I was able to contact him, but only if he didn't close everything up properly and could hear me knocking.
Ich hatte dann schon so einen Sinn dafür entwickelt, wo ich dann einfach ganz
I developed a sense for when he was coming. I'd become nervous as soon as I heard these noises of the safe being moved, the concrete door being opened and the vibrations.
Die Erschütterungen und so und vorher auch schon gespürt irgendwie oder
These things I'd somehow sense or hear and my heart would start beating.
immer so Herzklopfen.
I'd feel myself stiffening and would break into a cold sweat. It would frighten me, make me feel very uneasy.
Einfach so ein Unbehagen, so ein mulmiges verspürt.
He probably needed an hour to open everything up. Imagine if something had happened to him or if he'd become ill. He'd never have been able to get the door open, and I would have become like an Egyptian pharaoh, buried but still alive. Later I'd have died and been preserved.
Konserviert.
Sometimes, when I was cleaning the pictures that are in the living room, I'd clutch one of Natascha's to my heart, or I'd kiss it and say, "You're a strong child. Don't give up."
Ein starkes Kind.
The police investigation into Natascha's disappearance continued. A dog handler from the federal police tipped off the task force about one of his neighbours in Strasshof. A recluse who owned a white van and whose house was protected by electronic surveillance systems. The task force in Vienna ordered local police to check out the man's address. Shortly afterwards, a fax arrived. The house was registered to Priklopil's mother, and there was no record of him living there. Local police also confirmed that his van had been checked 8 days earlier and that the task force already had the report. And he was struck off as a suspect. But what kind of a man was Priklopil? Even his best friend and business partner, Ernst Holzapfel, never suspected that his friend would turn out to be such a monster.
Ich habe den Herrn Priklopil bei Siemens kennengelernt. Da haben wir
I met Herr Priklopil at Siemens, where we had our vocational training and worked during the early 1980s.
Ich habe mich dann später selbstständig mit Wohnungssanierungen beschäftigt und habe Herrn
Later, I was renovating flats and hired him because I knew he was very reliable.
ihn eben als zuverlässigen Menschen kennengelernt habe. Was ich an ihm geschätzt habe,
I always appreciated the fact that he was very upstanding and that I could depend on him.
können.
But there was another side to him. He was shy and introverted.
Scheu und ein bisschen verschlossen.
In the coming months, the police hunt continued to follow up new leads, but all of them turned out to be false.
It was like going to my own execution when they called and said I had to go immediately to such and such a square near the school or my home. They'd found a bag and wanted to know if it was Natascha's, and a shoe or a pair of pants in a bush. Once they came upon a red jacket in a car parked inside a garage. Was that Natascha's? Oh, I was always very relieved when I realized that none of these things belonged to Natascha. Thank God they weren't her things.
The press published Brigitta's phone number, and police tapped her phone, hoping the kidnapper would call. And that's exactly what happened. But he turned out to be an imposter. Just another of the many leads which went nowhere. By now, 10-year-old Natascha suspected she had spent around 6 months locked in her underground prison. And her relationship with Pricklepeel had developed to the extent that she was allowed out of the cellar for short periods.
I didn't see daylight for a very long time. He was afraid that if I came upstairs, I might use some of his tools to attack him or try to escape if he allowed me to come out of the basement. When he was able to convince himself that I was scared of him and wouldn't run away, he let me come upstairs. But he always made sure he locked everything up so I couldn't get out.
Pricklepeel wanted her to call him master. And his unpredictable behaviour was also a form of torture. There were times when he behaved well, according to Natascha, and other times when he treated her appallingly.
He was obsessed with cleaning, and of course he was always wiping things that I might have touched. I wasn't supposed to touch anything. He thought that fingerprints were just as ugly as spots of grease. He'd treat me roughly if I left behind a fingerprint somewhere, not only because they'd be able to find one of my fingerprints, but because fingerprints on any surface were ugly. He would grab me by the wrist and use the back of my hand to wipe the prints off the refrigerator or the door frame.
Seit dem Zeitpunkt, nachdem Natascha Kampusch entführt wurde,
From the time that Natascha Kampusch was kidnapped,
einmal im Jahr
I visited the house maybe twice a year, but never noticed anything unusual.
Ungewöhnliches bemerkt.
In the beginning, he made me wear these terrible plastic bags on my head. Plastic bags that I had to attach to my hair with a rubber band. It was awful because the plastic always stained my scalp. I also had to pull back my hair and tie it up with clips and rubber bands, and they dug into my scalp. Once he said it would be easier if my head was shaven, because it was such a nuisance with the bags. So he gave me scissors when he felt he could trust me. Blunt scissors, of course, so I couldn't harm myself. And I cut my hair short.
Over the months that followed, he continued to try to break her spirit, and his behaviour was both violent and threatening.
There were times when he would torment me or try to humiliate me. I'd run to the window and try to call the police. Then he'd grab me, really quite brutally, and drag me away from the window. Then he'd try to choke me and beat me. Of course, there were also times when I almost felt safer in my cell than upstairs in the house, where I'd have to do things I didn't want to do, like help him with the chores.
Everything he did was an attempt to control her. Natascha came to believe that what he wanted was someone who would never hurt or leave him. And a young girl, weak and deprived of food, was the perfect raw material.
schon eine sehr schlimme
Having
Sache,
to
weil
go
man kommt
hungry
dann
was
selbst auch
torture.
fast wie
I
ein
almost
Tod.
felt like a drug addict. I'd ask myself, why do I have to be hungry? Why do I even feel hunger? What does hunger feel like? Why can't I survive without food?
Hat einfach alles, was mir
He'd
zu
always
essen
show me
gegeben
big
hat,
portions of the things he was going to give me to eat, but then he'd cut up the tiniest bit and give it to me.
kleines Stück oder so
He controlled how much he gave me to eat to the nth degree.
und hat das einfach
He'd divide every portion and never let me eat as much as I
essen
wanted to.
lassen, wie und was ich wollte. Auch
As far as anyone knew, Pricklepeel had never had a girlfriend, and his relationship to women was complex.
Herr Pricklepeel war ein Einzelkind und nach dem Tod seines
Herr
Vaters
Pricklepeel was an only child.
eine sehr innige Beziehung zu seiner Mutter. Er stellte
When his father died,
bezüglich
he
Frauen
became very close to his mother.
Ansprüche. Diese
He
sollte
was very demanding when it came to
gepflegt
women.
sein, sollte schlank sein, sollte blonde Haare
He
haben.
wanted them to be well-groomed, slender and blonde.
Also diese hohen Ansprüche
Of course, these were very hard demands to fulfill.
waren natürlich schwer zu erfüllen.
Natascha has always refused to discuss whether she was sexually abused, but there's no doubt that Pricklepeel emotionally abused her.
damit hat er natürlich
He
auch
tried to manipulate me. He constantly tried to belittle me and told me I was useless and good for nothing and that I would never have a chance to escape.
entkommen. Es hat ihm einfach Spaß gemacht.
He very much enjoyed having someone to humiliate. And the more I resisted, the more he took pleasure in punishing and degrading me in order to strengthen his own self-esteem.
Zu unterdrücken und sein eigenes Selbstwertgefühl dadurch aufzubauen. Er wollte nicht, dass ich weine und hat mir deshalb
He didn't want me to cry, and each time I did, he'd rub my tears into my face with the back of my hand, or he'd seize me by the throat and choke me and drag me into the bathroom where he'd force my face down into the sink so that no more tears could flow. He forbade me to cry because he was scared the salt acid in my tears might damage the tiles.
von der Salzsäure der Tränen eingekriegt.
He always forced me either to look him straight in the eye or to cast my glance down to the floor in a very passive and submissive way. I couldn't do that for very long. I couldn't stand to, because it was against my nature to let myself be forced to do something I didn't want to do.
Ich mich einfach nicht zu etwas zwingen lasse, das ich nicht möchte.
Man ist so machtlos, man weiß ja wirklich nicht, was man machen
I was so utterly helpless that I didn't know what to do.
Ich hab nicht jeden Tag,
Some days I couldn't even go out because
wenn die Verfassung,
I was so lonely and
wo
depressed.
ich ganz traurig war und ganz, ja,
I kept on thinking, for God's sake, what's happening to my child? What is she having to go through?
sie, was passiert, das ist ein Schmerz. Also,
What's happening to her? That's a kind of pain that I can scarcely put into words.
nachgedacht, gegrübelt, bin tagelange.
I sat and thought about it quite often, brooded over it, didn't leave home for days on end, so that I didn't have to meet anyone who might say hello or ask me, how's it going?
Antworten und dem aus dem Weg zu
I didn't leave the house for days.
aus dem Haus gegangen.
It would be years before Brigitte had any news, but amazingly, Pricklepeel's best friend would actually get to meet Natascha without realizing she was being held prisoner.
Er kam dann später in Begleitung
He was with a young girl.
Mädchens, gab
I
ihr
shook
die
hands
Hand
with her
und
and said
sagte,
hello.
"Grüß Gott."
Natascha Kampusch was only 10 when she was kidnapped on her way to school. 4 years on, despite a massive hunt, the Austrian police were no closer to finding her abductor than when she disappeared.
Man ist dort im Finstern.
You're locked up there in the dark,
Dieser Strom ist
there's no electricity, and you're hungry.
Was hat das noch für einen Sinn?
Then you think to yourself, What's the point of this? Why not just put an end to this torment? But then you come to the conclusion that because the whole situation is so hideously unjust, you shouldn't allow yourself to give up. That would be an admission of defeat. There was a kind of fighting spirit that kept me alive.
Frustrated by the police's inability to find her, a private detective developed his own theory about the case, that Natascha's mother and a local businessman were somehow involved in her disappearance.
The private detective came up with a story that I was having an affair with this businessman and that Natascha was in the way. So we murdered her and hid her body in his pond. He drove the police quite crazy. They thought the solution was to start digging. So they did. But they found nothing.
By now, Natascha and Pricklepeel, who'd never given up trying to control her, had developed a routine. Their extraordinary living arrangements had to some extent become normalized. They had breakfast together. Natascha would cook and do the housework, and she loved to read.
Hat viel Bücher bekommen.
He had lots of books and probably still all the books that he'd had to read at school. Eventually I got them all. Later he bought me some non-fiction books, which I love. Non-fiction books along with encyclopedias.
Für mich gekauft. Ich wollte mir auf meine eigene Art und Weise.
He also bought some books on philosophy for me as well. There was so much I wanted to learn and find out for myself.
Aufgaben erbeten, also so Bücher, wo
So I also asked him to bring me maths books with exercises I could do.
darum gebeten, dass diese
He was good at maths, so I asked him to correct these exercises, which he did. But unfortunately, in such a way that he discovered mistakes everywhere, because that was his nature, and he wanted to humiliate me.
den anderen runtermachen.
So he marked everything with a red pen. It was as if he wanted me to feel that he was the headmaster, that he was playing some kind of game in which he was always in charge.
Alle spielen.
The first few years on her birthday, I always baked Natascha a cake. Obviously, I throw it away a few weeks later, but I always tried to make myself believe that she was still alive. Despite the awfulness, despite the uncertainty, I don't know. It was my way of communicating with her as if by telepathy.
An meinem Geburtstag habe ich immer
On my birthday, I always thought of all the birthdays I'd had as a child. I'd celebrate with a party and a cake, and there would be lots of other children there. Now it's completely different. I'm in a cellar and quite alone.
Verlies, ganz alleine.
Even though the police investigation continued, by now no one, apart from Brigitte, thought that there was any chance of finding Natascha alive.
The magistrate's office phoned up and offered to help. I went along and they told me something I'll never forget to this day, that I should buy a burial plot so that I'd have somewhere to go when I wanted to talk to Natascha. I ran out of the office, sat in the car and howled. I wasn't able to drive home. That was my daughter they were talking about. There was no proof that she was dead. As far as I was concerned, she was still alive, and I never doubted that over the 8.5 years.
Die ganzen 8,5 Jahre.
Over these years, Natascha gained Pricklepeel's trust. Gradually, he allowed her more and more freedom, and she eventually persuaded him to let her go outside the house.
Mit den Jahren, ich durfte dann
After a few years, he let me go into the garden with him, even though it was only at night. And for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, I was so happy that I was able to touch the bushes and the trees. I could feel the grass and the wind on my skin. Obviously, there wasn't any wind in the house. It was so wonderful. I asked him if I could cut off a piece of the hedge and take it back with me as a souvenir, really. That's not normal. Who else would take something from the garden into the house as a souvenir?
Wer nimmt sich schon vom Garten irgendwas als Andenken ins Haus mit?
When she was still little, Natascha had promised herself that she'd escape as soon as she had the chance. But that chance wouldn't come for many years. It wasn't until just before her 18th birthday, and had changed so much that no one would recognize her, that Pricklapil felt it was safe to take her outside the house.
Lots of people wonder why I didn't just run away while he was busy doing something else. But he made sure that I was always carrying something heavy. He made it impossible for me to escape. He was very good at it, at putting me under pressure. We went out for a drive once in his Mercedes. He told me that if I tried to say anything or make any kind of signal, he'd kill them, so there would be no witnesses. Then he'd kill me and anyone else that had seen me. It was hopeless.
Das war dann einfach aussichtslos. Und dann gab es eine Begebenheit, da sind wir zum Baumarkt gefahren.
Another time we were on our way to a builder's merchant's and ended up in a traffic jam.
Da war dann so eine Polizeikontrolle.
There was a police checkpoint on the road ahead of us.
Ziemlich stämmiger.
The policeman in charge was a big, good-natured kind of guy, but he didn't seem to be particularly intelligent.
So viel Intelligenz.
When we stopped, I tried to signal with my eyes that something was wrong, but he didn't seem to notice anything. He probably thought I was retarded or an epileptic or something. He didn't notice. And he didn't ask any questions. He just checked the registration documents and waved us through.
Nett abgewunken. Wenn irgendjemand aus einem Auto.
If someone jumps out of a car and starts pounding on the window of other cars, they don't inspire a lot of confidence in other people. And the way I looked at that time, pale, thin and weak, they'd have thought I was either a drug addict or crazy.
Natascha had never shown any sign of trying to escape, and she believed Pricklapil hoped that she stayed with him because she wanted to, not because she was being forced to. And he gradually began to integrate her into his life.
Und etwa im Juli 2006 hat mich Herr Pricklapil...
Around July 2006, Herr Pricklapil called and said that he wanted to borrow the trailer.
Dann sind wir eben eines Abends dann noch.
One evening we drove to this hall to get the trailer, the one he and Holzapfel owned together. When I saw Herr Holzapfel, I didn't know if he was his accomplice. And even if he wasn't, would he believe anything I said? He was obviously his best friend. That was obvious.
Kam dann später in Begleitung eines jungen Mädchens.
He was with a young girl.
Als ich
When I opened the door, he introduced me to her
sah ich dann das Mädchen
and said that she was an acquaintance.
und stellte mir sie aus
I
dem
shook hands with her and said hello.
Ich gab ihr die Hand und sagte ein Grüß Gott.
Das war auch keine Situation, wo man.
It wasn't the kind of situation where I could have said something or tried to escape. So I behaved like a good girl, shook his hand and said nothing, just like he told me to.
Eingebläut hatte und
But Natascha hadn't given up on making her escape. And a month later, she would finally get her chance.
Heute um 13:04 Uhr entdeckt eine Passantin eine junge Frau.
Today at 1:04 p.m., a passerby discovered a confused young woman in a garden in Straßhof in Gensandorf. She alerted the police. The young woman claimed to be Natascha Kampusch.
By now, she was 18. She'd been imprisoned for 8 painful years.
der Täter war am Handy.
The criminal was on his cell phone and he ordered me to vacuum his car, the van actually.
Kleinbus. Und das habe ich auch irgendwie gemacht.
But I was making so much noise that he went over to the swimming pool. He left the garden gate unlocked, and I knew that this was my chance. I left the vacuum cleaner running and ran off as fast as my feet would carry me. I ran to the left to these allotments and jumped over the fence in a panic because he might be following me. Then I was in a garden and the kitchen window was open. I begged the woman to call the police. I had to spend a bit of time persuading her that I was serious.
I began crying and screaming and laughing for joy. And my grandchildren didn't know what was the matter with me. I explained that Natascha was back, and then we all left together. It was a feeling like I was 100% certain. I never doubted for a second that it really was Natascha, although some people doubted that it was her. It was so sweet. Natascha looked at me and tugged my jacket and said to me, "You're still so pretty and sexy. I thought you might have become a wrinkly old bag by now." And I thought, that's my daughter.
This was Natascha's precious route to freedom. She ran down this lane and then begged a neighbour to call the police. But those 8 lost years remain a riddle. What exactly was Natascha's relationship with her kidnapper? Those who have spoken to her say it was complicated.
Immediately after Natascha escaped, the Viennese police force went on full alert, hunting down Priklepil. Police also searched the house and found the entrance to the cellar in the garage. It was well hidden. A cupboard and a stack of tyres concealed a safe. Once police moved the safe, they discovered a door made of concrete and steel, weighing around 22 stone, set into a wall which was 1.5 feet thick. Finally, they came to a double wooden door. It was the perfect place to hide away his victim.
Ich erinnere mich, dass mich Herr Priklepil vor der Entführung im Zuge unserer Wohnung.
I remember once that when we were in the middle of renovating apartments, that Herr Priklepil asked me the best way to install sound insulation, so that even if you were using a hammer drill, nobody in the whole house would be able to hear him. This was before the kidnap. I explained that cement was good for blocking out people's voices. But for a hammer drill, it would be better to use mineral wool. When the police searched the house, I was horrified to discover that he'd done exactly that when he came to build the cellar.
Hours after Natascha's escape, Priklepil made sure he would never have to answer for his crimes.
Und wie soeben bekannt geworden ist, hat der
It's just been reported that the alleged kidnapper has committed suicide.
Da dürfte
I imagine that he drove to the train station and lay down on the tracks. Then the train ran over his head and he was dead.
Dann war tot.
It was impossible for Natascha to escape the frenzied media attention. When she appeared on television a few days later, she amazed people at how articulate and self-possessed she was. When it was discovered that the police had investigated Prickly Peel early on, a scandal erupted of epic proportions. Had the police been negligent? Was there a cover-up? There were even rumours that Prickly Peel had been a sadomasochist and part of a child pornography ring. Could anyone else have been involved in the kidnapping?
Man versucht natürlich auch Schlagzeilen zu machen.
Of course they wanted headlines. Child porno ring was often used in connection with Natascha Campus, and it was so unpleasant. There weren't any sadomasochists involved, nor was there a child pornography ring. As far as I was concerned, I was only ever in contact with the criminal. Was he involved in any of these things? I don't think so. He wouldn't have had the time. But we'll never know. If you could have asked him, he'd probably have denied everything. Even then, no one would have believed him because people are obsessed with things like sadomasochism and child pornography rings. That's what it comes down to. People are fascinated by horrible things. They won't leave it alone. They like to embellish and exaggerate, so these things are even more horrible, more nauseating, and more repulsive than they actually are. The press asked me whether I was raped or sexually abused and so on. But in my eyes, what the media did to me after I escaped was also a form of abuse, and they should be punished too.
Today, Natascha is the official owner of the house. It's now a dark memento of her 8 years of incarceration.
I got everything that you want, like a heart that is so true. Just call on me and I'll send a lot with love from me to you.
It's been more than a decade since she was snatched on her way to school. Even now, Natascha's feelings towards Prickly Peel and her years of imprisonment and enslavement by him are complex.
Wenn ich ihm das nicht verziehen hätte, dann wäre ich selbst zu voll.
If I weren't able to forgive him, I would have been so full of hate and negativity that these feelings would have become unbearable and destroyed me eventually.
So eine Tat resultiert ja zumeist
A crime like the one he committed is usually the result of illness or some kind of emotional damage, and no one can really be held responsible for being so misguided.
Kann der Mensch nichts.
But this criminal had a conscience. He was aware on some level of what he was doing. But it's also obvious that he saw kidnapping someone as the solution to his problems. And that made me feel sorry for him. I pitied him. So many people are looking for happiness in their lives and fail to find it.
Viele Menschen sind auf der Sinnsuche ihres Lebens.
And he thought that because this had been denied him by life, by fate, he had to take by force what was rightfully his.
Nicht so geben kann, muss sich das einfach nehmen.
As for me, I just want people to treat me normally. I think I've earned the right, just like anyone else. I don't know. I think that people should be glad that I've survived, more or less.
Und dass ich das halbwegs überstanden habe.
There's no point hiding anything from Patrick Jane. As The Mentalist, he'll know anyway. It's the long-awaited return of one of the classiest US dramas. Don't miss the season premiere, Friday at 9 here on 5. Next tonight, brand new NCIS. Stay with us.